I'm Matthew Johnson, Chair of the Common Sense Policy Group and Professor of Public Policy at Northumbria University in the northeast of England. In this talk, I want to set out the case for why high-income societies urgently need a progressive blueprint for government, what the areas for development of that blueprint might look like, and critically, why we want to work with colleagues internationally to develop evidence to underpin it. I will draw on work that the Common Sense Policy Group has produced over the past 2 years as the basis for a broader conversation about how we might work together to develop something that is genuinely internationally applicable. The argument is straightforward. Neoliberalism succeeded not just as an economic program, but as an easily understandable and applicable political one. It offered politicians and electorates a simple, coherent set of principles that could be applied across very different national contexts. It is now clear that those principles have produced a series of crises that cannot be overcome by pursuing more of the same. The poverty, inequality, and insecurity produced is not sustainable socially, economically, or politically. However, there is no comparable progressive equivalent. That absence is not merely an intellectual failure, it is a political one that has left the field open to the right and increasingly to the far right to define the terms of debate about how to address the financial insecurity that most people in high-income countries now experience. We want to work with colleagues internationally to develop the evidence to underpin a blueprint for progressive change. Let me set out what I'm going to cover. I want to start with the question of why progressive politics has lacked a blueprint for government, and why that matters so acutely right now. I will then set out the programme of work the Common Sense Policy Group has produced, Act Now, Basic Income, the policy that changes everything, and the forthcoming national renewal. I will explain common sense principles, economic rules, and spending multipliers that provide the analytical framework underpinning all of the material basis of our policy development. I will then move on to what I think is the most important part of this conversation: the aim and objectives for collaborative work going forward. Our aim is to produce a blueprint for recovery in high-income countries, one that identifies the principles and sequencing of reform, examines global comparative evidence, and engages significant policymakers with the findings. Everything I say today is oriented towards this. The Common Sense Policy Group was formed in 2024 with a very specific purpose. We wanted to develop a whole-of-government programme for progressive government in the UK that was feasible, affordable and popular. We sought to provide a ready-made programme that would be lying around, ready to be adopted when it became clear that the governing approach had failed. In the UK, that moment has arrived much faster than many expected. We are a core interdisciplinary group of academics, economists and policy specialists working with international collaborators. We work with think tanks, political parties and policymakers. We are non-partisan. We try to identify what works and to make that case as persuasively and rigorously as possible to enable policymakers to act. Our published output to date includes Act Now, published in 2024, which set out a fully costed and financed programme for UK government across 10 core policy areas. In 2025, we published Basic Income, the policy that changes everything, which makes the case for social security reform as the foundation for everything else that the state needs to achieve, including net zero. We are currently finalising national renewal, due in 2027, which goes much further. It includes comprehensive state restructuring, a serious treatment of decriminalisation of self-regarding harms, updated multiplier modelling, and a substantial new public opinion dataset. Importantly, we address chronic inequality between, as well as within, regions, one of the most destabilising phenomena within modern societies. Our overarching aim is to produce a multiply realisable blueprint for recovery that is applicable across high-income countries, not just the UK. To understand what we are trying to do, we need to understand what we are trying to replace, and why that approach was adopted regardless of the damaging impacts it produced. Neoliberal reform was not simply the product of bad ideas, it emerged from a genuine crisis. Orthodox policy mechanisms in the 1970s failed to deal with inflation, unemployment, and the collapse of the post-war settlement. Into that vacuum stepped a set of thinkers, Hayek, Friedman, and others, who had long been dismissed as cranks, but who had a clear and simple program that could be applied anywhere quickly. Privatization, fiscal restraint, deregulation, and free movement of capital and labour. Crucially, it was underpinned by the broader cultural trend of individualization of responsibility for outcomes. The idea that what happens to individuals in their lives is the consequence individual choices, not of the social conditions faced. Reform became synonymous with neoliberalism. The critical point is not just that these ideas were wrong, though they were, and the evidence for that is now overwhelming. The critical point is that they were simple. They could be communicated to politicians in any country. They could be adopted in radically different national contexts. They gave governments facing different crises a common toolkit. Progressives have never produced anything comparable. And without a comparable blueprint, the right, and particularly now the far right, retains a monopoly on responses to the financial insecurity that now drives policy preferences across high-income countries. That monopoly must be broken if societies are to recover. What would a progressive blueprint look like? We think the starting point is to invert the neoliberal settlement with regard to the public on private spheres. Neoliberalism expanded the private sector and contracted the public sphere. We argue that government should instead focus on securing the social determinants of outcomes, the conditions that determine people's health, education, well-being, employment, and life chances. At the same time, government should withdraw from the punishment of self-regarding harms, the things people do to themselves that are far better addressed by mitigating social determinants and viewing activities, such as drug consumption, as being matters for the health system. The aim is to promote resilient non-interference, a society in which people are genuinely protected from arbitrary interference from employers, landlords, partners, and the state by addressing the vulnerability caused by poverty and insecurity. There is growing evidence that financial insecurity is the primary driver of policy preferences across high-income countries, and that social security, most effectively delivered through less conditional schemes, is a critical means of mitigating the drift to the far right. Environmental and resource crises increasingly underpin financial insecurity. Securing cheap, abundant, renewable energy is not just an environmental imperative, it is the foundation for the economic stability that rebuilding societies requires. Other critical challenges include housing, which is an intergenerational crisis blighting countries, including Australia and Canada. It is clear that leaving these crises to the market and refusing to tax wealth is not a sustainable approach. But how approaches can be distilled to multiply realizable principles, and how progressive government can sequence their approaches to applying these principles remain genuinely contested and context-dependent. As such, international collaboration to develop and distill evidence and to work through questions of application and prioritization is needed. An example of what principles might look like includes our common sense economic rules. These rules are intended to replace the fiscal rules that have driven austerity in the UK and elsewhere. They are grounded in outcomes of importance to society rather than arbitrary targets. First, poverty and income and wealth inequality, nationally and within and between nations and regions, must be in the process of falling by the third year of any forecast. This is a commitment to outcomes, not processes. Second, public sector net worth must increase by the fifth year. This is a fundamental reorientation. No serious business assesses its financial performance without accounting for its assets, yet governments routinely do exactly that. Third, public sector net financial liabilities, adjusted for our spending multipliers, which I discuss shortly, must reduce sustainably by the 10th year, insulating the economy from international price shocks via investment in secure, low-cost renewable energy and the re-establishment of local manufacturing capacity for products essential to national security. These rules are designed to be robust across different national contexts. They do not mandate specific policies. They set the outcomes that policy must achieve. That is precisely the kind of framework that can be adapted to different countries while maintaining coherence as a programme. The question skeptics always ask is, can governments actually afford this? The answer, based on our modelling, is not only yes, but that the question is the wrong way around. The question should be, can we afford not to do this? A fully funded, fully costed programme of national renewal that rebuilds manufacturing and public services and reduces poverty and inequality to historic lows is feasible, popular and affordable. The GDP increases generated by the programme are large enough to bring the debt-to-GDP ratio down significantly and to generate surpluses that can fund an even more ambitious programme or reduce national debt over time. The costed and micro-simulated approach we set out in Act Now effectively eliminates poverty over time and drives growth and employment. It rapidly transitions economies to net zero while protecting workers in high-carbon industries through what we call a quadruple lock, a set of guarantees around employment, pay, retraining and status for those whose industries are wound down. It secures cheap, abundant energy. It addresses the polluted and failed infrastructure that has become emblematic of the consequences of privatisation in the UK. It reduces crime, because wealthier communities with lower inequality are less crime-ridden. It fully funds health, social care and education. It builds affordable housing. It delivers effective public transport. Critically, it demonstrates to populations who have lost faith in government that progressive politicians can deliver real change. That demonstration effect is not incidental to the programme, it is central to it. All of this is grounded in new economic modelling. Our multiplier analysis is based on data from 25 advanced economies covering 1996 to 2019, a much broader evidence base than conventional fiscal models, and one that produces significantly different results. Capital spending on infrastructure, research and development, schools, hospitals, has a peak multiplier effect of 2.99 in year 9 of a forecast. That means that for every pound or euro spent, the economy eventually generates almost £3 or euros in return. Assuming tax receipts at 40% of GDP, government quickly starts to profit from its own investment. Current spending on public sector salaries, welfare, health and education has a peak multiplier of 1.35 in year 2, declining to approximately 0 by year 6. The interaction between capital and current spending is critical and often ignored. An increase in capital spending, but a cut to current spending, as the UK government has attempted to do, means that the gains from one are almost entirely cancelled out by the losses from the other. In year 2 of such an approach, the economy gains just 18 pence per pound and faces additional costs from worse health, employment and crime outcomes over time. Multipliers work in both directions. The devastating losses imposed by over a decade of cuts to public spending compound over time. They have cost high-income economies far more than the savings they appeared to generate. This must end. There needs to be much higher investment in both current and capital spending to rebuild our societies. This chart illustrates the multiplier effect I have just described. What you can see clearly is the long-term, sustained return from capital spending, the sustained upward trajectory peaking in year 9, compared with the shorter-term, declining return from current spending. One point I want to emphasise, because it is often misrepresented: the decline in the current spending multiplier back towards zero does not represent a loss. It is a return to baseline. There is no statistically significant negative effect. The implication is clear. We need sustained capital investment, not short-term stimulus and retreat. And we need current and capital spending to move together, not in opposite directions. This chart shows average annual UK GDP growth by decade across the period of the post-war settlement and the subsequent neoliberal era. The pattern is unambiguous. The sustained public investment of the immediate post-war decades, the infrastructure, the NHS, the welfare state, the expansion of education, produced decades of strong growth. As neoliberal policies took hold from the late 1970s onwards, growth declined. The 2010s, the decade of the most aggressive austerity, saw growth at its lowest sustained level outside of crisis years. Any increase in growth in that decade was a bounce back from the global financial crisis of 2007/08. This is not a coincidence. It is the direct, measurable consequence of public disinvestment. This chart is one of the most powerful pieces of evidence available in understanding that investment works and austerity does not. The central claim of austerity politics has always been that cutting public spending reduces debt. The evidence does not support this. Since the 2008 financial crisis, national debt in the UK has risen consistently, despite sustained and politically painful attempts to reduce public spending. Austerity has not reduced the debt. It has reduced the economy's capacity to generate the growth that actually brings debt down as a share of GDP. High investment economies demonstrate the alternative. Countries that maintained investment through and after the financial crisis, Australia being perhaps the most instructive example, have consistently better debt to GDP outcomes than those that embraced austerity. Debt comes down through economic success. Economic success requires investment. These ought not to be controversial propositions. They are only odd because of 5 decades of neoliberal dogma. The political challenge is making that case simply and persuasively enough that it reaches voters and politicians. Public opinion on these questions has shifted significantly. Austerity commanded genuine public support in the years immediately after the 2008 financial crisis. The arguments about fiscal responsibility, the analogy with household budgets, the promise that short-term pain would produce long-term gain, these were persuasive to enough people to provide political cover for sweeping cuts that harm the vast majority of society. That support has collapsed. There is now a strong consensus in survey data across high-income countries that austerity has made societies less fair, less equal, less free, less efficient, less wealthy, and less happy. the public wants greater public spending and more generous social security for people in and out of work. Social security is, in our analysis, the priority, not because other areas of policy are less important, but because the effects of financial insecurity on everything else are so pervasive. Reducing the risk of destitution is the foundation for all other action. There is a clear pathway from secure social security to the kind of material well-being that makes other essential changes politically possible, including the Green New Deal policies that environmental crises demand. One of the most significant and politically important findings from our public opinion work concerns the structure of support for progressive reform. The assumption among many pollsters, political strategists and party leaders has been that different groups in society hold fundamentally different values, that working class or left behind voters have different cultural priorities that make them resistant to progressive economic programs. Our data do not support that assumption. Support for progressive reform is broadly consistent across ethnicity, region of residency, and gender identity. These demographic characteristics are not significant predictors of policy preference. What does predict more conservative socioeconomic preferences is older age, higher socioeconomic status, and better health, which are themselves closely correlated. Even among older and higher status respondents, there is a plurality of support for significant progressive change. In contrast to values-based analyses of British preferences, we find that people at greater risk of destitution recognise their material interests very clearly. They understand what progressive policies would do for them when they are presented with those policies. What they lack is confidence that politicians will actually deliver, having seen decades of failure to act, with the phenomenon of PASOKification very real. Progressive parties that do not protect workers from financial phenomena become politically irrelevant. This is a crisis of political trust, not a crisis of values, and it creates both a challenge and an opportunity. If progressive politicians deliver, if they show that a progressive policy programme works, trust can be rebuilt. But there is no shortcut. They have to deliver. This brings me to the core of what I hope we can discuss and develop together. Our aim is to produce a blueprint for recovery in high-income countries. A programme comparable in its clarity and replicability to the neoliberal blueprint, but grounded in evidence, in addressing the core material crises of our age, and in the outcomes that people actually need. We have identified 5 objectives that we believe need to be achieved to make that blueprint genuinely internationally applicable. First, to distill the principles and sequencing of priorities for reform, to work out not just what should be done, but in what order and under what conditions. Second, to examine comparatively global examples of reform approaches using the most powerful quantitative tools available: macro, micro analysis and microsimulation. Drawing on the UK household longitudinal study, the Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey, the European Union statistics on income and living conditions, and broader macroeconomic datasets. Third, to conduct a comparative analysis of policymaker perspectives on reform through survey and interview. Fourth, to conduct nationally representative surveys in key high-income countries, including Australia, Spain and the UK, to establish what populations believe is feasible. And fifth, to examine the findings publicly with internationally significant policymakers so that the work reaches those who can act on it. These are not abstract research objectives. They are the components of a programme that could genuinely change what governments do. Let me say a little more about the comparative evidence objective, because it is both intellectually important and politically necessary. Much of the opposition to progressive reform rests on putative claims that there are no precedents, that what we are proposing has never been tried or has been tried and failed. This is an erroneous and damaging notion. It is also, to be frank, hypocritical. Neoliberal reforms were themselves largely unevidenced when introduced, and were rarely reversed even when the evidence of their failure was overwhelming. The "there is no alternative" framing is demonstrably false. High investment societies, including at various times Scandinavian countries, Australia, Canada, show that better outcomes are possible. The question is not whether alternatives exist, but what the size and nature of the effects are, and under what conditions they transfer to different national contexts. That is precisely what our comparative methodological work is designed to establish. We use longitudinal data sets in each comparator country, the UK Household Longitudinal Study, the HILDA survey in Australia, EUSILC in Europe, alongside broader macroeconomic data. We combine this with microsimulation, policymaker surveys, and nationally representative public opinion data. The aim is to build a transferable evidence base, not just to show that something works somewhere, but to understand why it works, how it works, and what would need to be in place for it to work elsewhere. Our aim is to produce a blueprint for recovery in high-income countries, applicable wherever neoliberalism has failed. That is most of the high-income world. The work I've described today represents the starting point for that project. We have the analytical framework, the common sense principles, economic rules, and spending multipliers. We have the UK programme, Act Now, Basic Income, and the forthcoming national renewal. We have the public opinion data. What we need now is the comparative dimension, the evidence base that allows us to say with confidence that this approach works not just in one national context, but across many. That requires distilling the principles and sequencing of reform across different national contexts. It requires comparative examination of global examples using the most robust methods available. It requires policymaker surveys and nationally representative public opinion data. And it requires making the findings publicly available in ways that reach the people who can act on them. Progressive politics has spent too long without a programme. The consequences, declining public services, rising inequality, growing support for the far right, are visible everywhere. We have both the intellectual tools and the political urgency to do something about that. I hope that today is the beginning of a conversation about how we can do it together.